The question may seem almost too simple to bother asking at first, but once you examine the details, it becomes one of the most interesting areas of study in animal behavior. We will examine it carefully now. Consider a large, dominant wolf that could easily overpower any other pack member with little trouble. It gets knocked over by an awkward young pup that has only recently learned to walk steadily. The pup bites at the adult face, pulls on an ear, and climbs across the back as if the adult were furniture instead of a top predator. The adult simply allows this to continue. There is no growling, no correction, and no enforcement of the pack hierarchy that the same adult would firmly apply if another adult wolf showed similar disrespect. During that brief period of puppyhood, the usual rules somehow cease to apply. This is not a rare accident either. The same pattern of animals applying a completely different set of rules to their young than they apply to adults appears across species that differ from one another as widely as possible. Once you begin to notice the pattern, it becomes hard to stop noticing it. So the real question is whether animals truly treat babies differently, and why the pattern appears so consistently across the animal kingdom, even in species that otherwise display almost no flexibility or tolerance in ordinary social life. We begin with what researchers call the puppy license, because the idea is genuinely useful and accounts for a large share of the behavior under discussion. In wolf packs and also in domestic dog social groups, young pups receive temporary social immunity. They can violate rules that would bring serious and sometimes violent discipline to an adult wolf, and instead receive a pass nearly every time. A pup can bite an alpha ear, take food straight from under an adult nose, or interrupt a serious social exchange without invitation, and the strongest response it is likely to meet is a firm nudge or a short, exaggerated grumble that is more performance than real punishment. This license usually ends around 4 to 5 months of age, at which point the young wolf suddenly finds that the rules it has ignored its whole life now apply to it, typically through a far less gentle correction than any it met before. Why would a species build in this kind of temporary exemption? The main explanation rests on brain development and learning. Young animals are still learning social cues, physical coordination, and communication signals. If every clumsy error met full adult-level severity, the result would be a population of permanently anxious, under-socialized adults that never properly learned how their own species' social systems operate. By easing the rules during this critical developmental window, the species creates a safe practice zone where young animals can make repeated mistakes without facing consequences severe enough to harm long-term development. It is built-in tolerance for incompetence, designed specifically so that learning can occur. The pattern grows more interesting because the leniency is not limited to social rule-breaking. It also extends into actual physical aggression and appears in a striking way among primates. Adult male chimpanzees that can be brutally violent toward rival males, and even toward females in certain situations, display a sharply different behavioral profile around infants, including infants that are not their own biological offspring. There are documented cases of adult males tolerating infants, climbing on them, pulling their fur, and even slapping at their faces during play, actions that would produce an immediate serious response if an adult chimpanzee tried the same things. Researchers studying the pattern point to something called infant handling tolerance, a behavioral category that appears specifically and consistently around juveniles, almost as if a separate set of behavioral software runs only for anything recognized as a baby. This raises a question worth considering carefully. How does an animal even recognize that something is a baby in the first place? Baby animals do not walk around with labels. The answer is one of the most interesting concepts in animal psychology and is known as the baby schema, sometimes also called by its original scientific term, Kinderschema. The concept describes a specific cluster of physical features, including a large head relative to body size, big eyes, a round face, and short limbs, that automatically triggers caretaking responses across a very wide range of species, including humans. This is not a chance coincidence. It is a deeply wired visual trigger that essentially short-circuits aggressive or dismissive responses and replaces them with gentleness, protectiveness, and increased attention. The striking part is that the trigger does not always stay neatly limited to a single species. Big eyes and a round face on a completely unrelated animal can still partially activate the same response, which helps explain why videos of baby animals of almost any species reliably attract wide attention. Our own baby detection system does not always verify species before it activates. Consider lions for a moment. because lion social structure supplies one of the most dramatic examples of differentiated treatment toward young, and the mechanics behind it can feel unsettling once they are understood. When a new male takes over a pride and displaces the previous dominant male, it is well documented that the incoming male will often kill cubs from the previous male bloodline. This appears to contradict the idea that animals are gentle and protective toward young, and in one sense it does, yet it actually strengthens the underlying point in a different way. The treatment young lions receive is not based on any universal species-wide gentleness rule. It is based entirely on relatedness and investment. Cubs that share the new male genetics receive intense, dedicated protection, tolerance for behavior that would never be accepted from an adult lion, and significant parental investment. Cubs that do not share his genetics receive the exact opposite treatment. This shows something important. A large share of differentiated treatment toward babies is not blanket softness toward anything small and helpless. It is a highly specific calculation tied to genetic investment, and the gentleness we associate with baby treatment is layered on top of that calculation and can sometimes be completely overridden by it. This is one of the most important nuances in the whole topic. Animal gentleness toward young is not some universal moral instinct floating free of evolutionary logic. It is tightly bound to investment, relatedness, and survival calculus. Where that calculus favors protection, we see extraordinary, almost theatrical gentleness. Where it does not, we sometimes see behavior that looks shockingly brutal by human standards. And both extremes arise from the same underlying evolutionary logic, simply pointed in different directions depending on the specific situation an animal faces. Now we turn to something less dramatic and more widely appealing. Alloparenting is a concept mentioned earlier, but it deserves a deeper look, specifically in the context of differentiated treatment. Alloparenting describes situations in which animals, other than the biological parents, take on caretaking responsibilities toward young, sometimes for short periods and sometimes for extended ones. Elephants provide a strong example. Within an elephant herd, young calves are cared for not only by their mother but by an entire network of related females, including aunts, older sisters, grandmothers, and sometimes even unrelated females that have joined the herd's social structure. These auntie-elephants display measurably different behavior toward calves than they show toward adult herd members. They tolerate clumsy bumping, allow calves to use their bodies for shade and protection, and actively position themselves to shield calves from threats during travel. This entire support network activates only around vulnerable young. Adult elephants do not extend the same protective behavior toward other adults nearly as readily, which shows that the pattern is not generalized elephant kindness. It is a very specific behavioral mode, switched on by the presence of vulnerable offspring. Meerkats supply one of the more entertaining examples of the same concept in action. Meerkat colonies operate with a strict and surprisingly rigid social hierarchy, consisting of dominant breeding pairs, subordinate helpers, and a clear pecking order, enforced through aggressive posturing and occasional actual aggression. Yet the moment pups are involved, that entire hierarchy appears to take a secondary place. Subordinate meerkats that might otherwise face aggression from dominant members instead receive notable patience, specifically while performing babysitting duties, standing guard over pups while the rest of the group forages, and sometimes going without food themselves to maintain that watch. Colony survival depends heavily on pups reaching adulthood, and that priority appears to reshape social dynamics, specifically around anything categorized as a vulnerable juvenile, even temporarily suspending normal hierarchy enforcement to ensure the babysitting is done properly. Consider next something genuinely unusual and slightly amusing: the differences in play behavior. Adult animals across a wide range of species display dramatically different play styles depending on whether they are interacting with another adult or with a juvenile. Adult dogs playing with other adult dogs tend to engage in fairly even reciprocal play, with matched intensity, mutual chasing, and roughly equal give and take. The same adult dog playing with a puppy will often deliberately handicap itself by exaggerating its movements, slowing its chase speed, and allowing the puppy to win small contests it would never win against a similarly sized adult. Researchers call this self-handicapping, and it appears across an impressively wide range of species, including primates, big cats in captivity, and even some birds. This is not accidental gentleness. It is a deliberate, calculated adjustment designed specifically to keep play within a range the younger animal can actually manage, which points to a level of behavioral flexibility and social awareness that is quite impressive for animals that are not always given enough credit. There is also something worth noting about vocal communication directed specifically at young versus adults. Many species use distinctly different vocalizations when communicating with juveniles, compared with other adults employing softer tones, simplified call structures, and repeated patterns. This may sound familiar because it is strikingly similar to the way human parents instinctively shift into a higher-pitched, slower, more exaggerated speech pattern when talking to infants, something researchers call parentese. Studies on certain primate species, and even some bird species, have identified comparable vocal adjustments directed specifically at young individuals, suggesting that the instinct to simplify and soften communication toward vulnerable juveniles may be a far more widespread evolutionary pattern than a uniquely human trait. Now we bring predators into the discussion, because predator behavior toward prey young supplies one of the most counterintuitive examples in the entire topic. There are documented cases, admittedly inconsistent, and species-dependent of certain predators, showing reduced predatory drive specifically toward very young prey animals compared with adults, sometimes choosing to ignore an extremely young, defenseless animal entirely in favor of pursuing an adult that requires significantly more effort to catch. This seems completely backward from a pure energy efficiency standpoint, because a baby animal should logically be the easiest possible meal. Some researchers suggest the pattern may relate to underdeveloped scent or movement cues in very young prey, failing to fully trigger a predator hunting response, essentially flying under the radar of instincts calibrated mainly toward adult prey behavior patterns. Others suggest it may simply be inconsistent individual variation rather than any deliberate sparing behavior. Either way, it is a genuinely strange wrinkle in a topic that otherwise leans heavily toward the idea that animals are deliberately gentler with babies, and it serves as a reminder that not every piece of the puzzle fits into one tidy explanation. We return now to something more emotionally satisfying: cross-species, baby tolerance. There are numerous documented cases of animals adopting, nursing, or protecting young from entirely different species, behavior that seems to circle back to the baby schema concept discussed earlier. Documented cases include dogs nursing orphaned kittens, cats caring for orphaned squirrels, and even more dramatic examples, such as a lioness in a wildlife reserve that was observed adopting and protecting an oryx calf for several days, despite oryx normally falling well within a lion-typical prey range. These cross-species adoption cases are rare, and they do not always end well, biologically speaking, but their existence at all tells us something important about how deeply wired the vulnerable young trigger gentleness instinct really is. It is powerful enough to occasionally override an animal's own predatory instincts entirely, even if only temporarily, simply because the visual and behavioral cues of helplessness are strong enough to flip a switch that evolution clearly built to prioritize protection over almost everything else. There is also a genuinely interesting angle involving hormonal changes that drive a large share of this differentiated treatment, and it is worth bringing in the actual biology rather than only describing the behavior. Prolactin and oxytocin levels rise significantly in many mammal species, specifically around the presence of vulnerable young, even in individuals that are not the biological parent. This hormonal shift has been documented not only in mothers, but in fathers, siblings, and even unrelated group members in certain cooperatively breeding species. These hormonal changes correlate directly with increased patience, increased caretaking behavior, and reduced aggression specifically toward the young that trigger the response. This means a large share of differentiated treatment toward babies is not purely a conscious behavioral choice an animal makes moment to moment. It is partly a measurable internal chemical shift that happens automatically in response to specific triggers. The same general mechanism, simply tuned slightly differently across an enormous range of unrelated species. Birds offer a particularly interesting variation on the whole topic, mostly because bird parenting involves a level of intensity that mammal parenting often does not quite match. Many bird species show extreme self-sacrificing behavior, specifically triggered by the presence of chicks. Parents will repeatedly risk their own safety, performing distraction displays to lure predators away from a nest, sometimes feigning injury themselves to draw attention away from vulnerable young. This kind of behavior essentially never appears in the context of protecting another adult bird. It is almost exclusively reserved for offspring specifically. The intensity of this differentiated treatment suggests that in many bird species, the presence of dependent young does not merely adjust behavior slightly, it fundamentally reorganizes an individual's entire risk tolerance and priority structure for as long as those young remain dependent. We should also consider something a little less obvious: physical gentleness calibration, the ability of an animal to adjust the literal physical force of its own actions depending on who it is interacting with. This appears dramatically in larger, more physically powerful animals. Adult gorillas, animals capable of exerting forces that could seriously injure or kill a human or another gorilla with little effort, have been repeatedly documented handling infants, both their own and occasionally human infants, in captive settings, with what can only be described as remarkable, almost surgical precision and restraint. This level of fine motor control, specifically calibrated around fragility, is not something that develops randomly. It suggests these animals possess a level of body awareness and intentional restraint that is genuinely impressive, especially considering how effortlessly destructive these same animals can be in other contexts entirely. There is also something worth discussing about how this differentiated treatment changes as young animals age, because it is rarely an all-or-nothing switch. It is usually a gradual scaling process. Young animals do not go from completely protected and indulged to fully held to adult standards overnight. Instead, most species show a slow tapering process in which tolerance for mistakes, physical roughness, and rule-breaking gradually decreases as the young animal demonstrates increasing competence, coordination, and social understanding. This tapering process appears to be at least partially responsive to the individual animal actual development, rather than a fixed, rigid timeline, meaning slower developing individuals within a species sometimes receive an extended grace period compared with their faster developing peers. This level of individualized calibration, adjusting tolerance based on actual observed competence rather than age alone, suggests a surprisingly sophisticated level of social tracking happening within these groups, with animals essentially running a constant informal assessment of where each young individual currently stands developmentally. There is also a fascinating angle involving sibling dynamics that almost never gets discussed, and it adds a whole extra layer of nuance to the topic. In species where multiple young are raised together, the differentiated treatment toward babies does not apply equally across every juvenile in the group. Older siblings in many species, including wolves, primates, and even certain birds, are gradually expected to take on more responsibility and tolerate less indulgence as younger siblings arrive, a phenomenon that looks almost suspiciously similar to the classic human experience of an older child suddenly being told to act their age the moment a new baby appears. Researchers studying primate troops have noted that juvenile chimpanzees, who once received extensive tolerance and gentle handling from adults, often see that tolerance shift dramatically once a younger sibling is born, with caretaking attention and behavioral leniency redirected almost entirely toward the newest, most vulnerable member of the family unit. This is not favoritism in some emotional sense. It is simply the same investment-based calculation discussed earlier, recalibrating in real time based on which individual currently represents the greatest vulnerability and the greatest evolutionary stakes. It is also worth examining how this differentiated treatment interacts with group size and resource availability, because the gentleness toward young that has occupied most of this discussion is not some fixed, unconditional constant. In times of severe resource scarcity, some species show a measurable reduction in the intensity of caretaking behavior, sometimes even abandoning the youngest or weakest offspring in a litter, entirely in favor of concentrating limited resources on the offspring most likely to survive regardless. This sounds harsh, and it is, but it reinforces something touched on throughout the entire discussion. Differentiated treatment toward babies is not some sentimental, unconditional rule written into nature out of pure compassion. It is a flexible, responsive system, constantly weighing investment against probability of survival, and that calculation can shift dramatically depending on environmental pressure, which is a far more interesting and nuanced explanation than simply assuming animals are uniformly soft and protective toward anything small and cute. There is also a genuinely underrated example worth bringing up here: domestic cats and their surprisingly specific tolerance thresholds toward kittens compared with adult cats. Anyone who has spent time around a multi-cat household has probably noticed that adult cats, even fairly grumpy, low-tolerance individuals, will often allow kittens to do things that would immediately trigger a hiss or a swat if attempted by another adult cat, such as pouncing unexpectedly, stealing food directly from a bowl mid-meal, or climbing over a sleeping adult without any warning whatsoever. This tolerance is not universal across all adult cats. Some show very little patience, regardless of age. Yet it appears consistently enough across enough individuals that researchers studying domestic cat social behavior have documented it as a measurable, repeatable pattern rather than just anecdotal cuteness. Even in a species famous for its general indifference and low tolerance for nonsense, something about the specific signals of a kitten seems to occasionally bypass the usual grumpiness settings entirely. Finally, it is worth touching on how zoos and wildlife sanctuaries have actually used this differentiated treatment phenomenon as a genuinely practical conservation tool. Caretakers working with endangered species have learned to recognize and sometimes deliberately trigger these baby schema responses in adult animals to encourage successful fostering or cross-species nursing in emergency situations where an orphaned animal needs immediate caretaking and no biological parent is available. By understanding exactly which physical and behavioral cues trigger increased tolerance and caretaking instinct in a given species, conservationists have successfully facilitated surrogate parenting arrangements that would have seemed completely implausible without a solid understanding of exactly how deeply wired this differentiated treatment toward young actually is. It is a genuinely elegant example of scientific understanding translating directly into real-world impact, saving individual animals by working with instincts that evolution built millions of years before anyone thought to study them this closely. So do animals treat babies differently? Overwhelmingly and resoundingly yes. And the mechanisms behind it turn out to be a genuinely fascinating mix of hardwired visual triggers, measurable hormonal shifts, deliberate behavioral calibration, and evolutionary logic tied directly to genetic investment and species survival. This is not some simple universal kindness switch that flips on whenever something small and helpless wanders into view, though that baby schema trigger does a great deal of work across species. It is a layered, surprisingly sophisticated system that adjusts tolerance, gentleness, communication style, physical restraint, and even risk tolerance, all specifically calibrated around the presence of vulnerable, young, sometimes overriding instincts as powerful as predatory drive itself. And perhaps the most interesting part of all this is how familiar it feels once you look at it closely. The exaggerated, gentle play, the simplified communication style, the temporary suspension of normal rules. The willingness to take on serious risk, specifically to protect something small and helpless, these are not uniquely human parenting behaviors that occasionally appear in animals by coincidence. They are ancient, deeply conserved evolutionary strategies that appear across an enormous range of unrelated species precisely because they work. Populations that protect, indulge, and patiently nurture their young consistently outcompete populations that do not. We are not actually special for treating our babies differently. We are simply one more entry on an extremely long list of species that figured out somewhere along the evolutionary road that the smallest, clumsiest, most rule-breaking members of the group are usually the ones most worth protecting, indulging, and giving just a little extra grace to, right up until the day the puppy license finally